Welcome to FACT's Pasture Weed Management and Identification webinar. Our presenter today is Dr. Mark Renz from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. This webinar is hosted by Food Animal Concerns Trust. I am Larissa McKenna, FACT's Humane Farming Program Director, and I will be moderating today's session. All right, so before we dive into the presentation itself, here are just a few quick introductions. Food Animal Concerns Trust, or FACT. We are a national nonprofit organization that's headquartered in Illinois. And we promote the safe and humane production of meat, milk, and eggs. I direct FACT's Humane Farming Program, which provides a variety of opportunities for livestock and poultry farmers. And this webinar is part of our Humane Farming webinar series. I encourage you all to visit our website to learn more about all of our other farmer services, including our upcoming webinars and our very popular Fund a Farmer grant program. For those of you who haven't heard yet, we are accepting applications for our next round of grants through December 2nd. So at this time, I'm very pleased to introduce our presenter, Dr. Mark Renz. Mark is a professor and extension weed specialist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His work focuses on weed management in perennial agronomic crops and on invasive plants in natural areas. We are very lucky to have him with us to share his experience and his insight today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Renz so he may begin his presentation. Mark, please take it away.
Thanks, Larissa, and it's really a pleasure to be here and get a chance to talk to you about pastures. And in Wisconsin and the Midwest, they're a cornerstone of our agronomic practices. Some states a little bit more than the others, and even nationally too. So I'm just going to overview a few of the issues with weeds in our pasture systems and what some of the cost weeds do pose to our pastures and how we can approach managing it too. I realize that there are a lot of people from a lot of different parts of the nation, so I'm going to try and give you some general comments. Much of my research is obviously done in Wisconsin, but I have had time in the West and California, as well as in New Mexico, so do have a wide range of experience, and I can touch on some of those issues as needed. So being in Wisconsin, I have to show you dairy cows. So that's why my introductory slide presents that. So I always like to start off these presentations just to kind of summarize things right up front and what some of the key issues, so you can kind of think about these as I'm going through and talking about these in more details. And really, to sum things up, weeds can impact pastures, but they don't necessarily always impact pastures. And so I like to kind of follow a three-step approach when we have weeds in our pastures, with the first step identifying what species we have, because management and the cost associated with those weeds is going to be very different for different weed species. And then, once we identify them, we need to watch them or monitor them and see, are they problematic? Are they increasing or decreasing? A lot of times these weeds, as you'll see, are actually eaten by our animals or livestock, and that might be the easiest approach to managing them. But if they're not and they're a problem, we're going to need to manage them, and we'll talk about some of the simple approaches you can do to manage them. It could be as simple as changing some of your grazing practices. You could be adding some inputs such as fertilizer, renovating pastures, mowing, and there are opportunities to use herbicides in some cases that can be effective. And we'll briefly discuss some of those issues. But I want to emphasize that really the results and the impact of these weeds are really, really specific to your region. So we're really fortunate, particularly in the upper Midwest, is we have really robust competitive pastures. And if we can follow proper grazing management practices, weeds are often not a major component and not a major issue unless some of our practices get out of whack, or we don't have the capabilities to conduct these to the right details. So we really need to check with specific recommendations in your region, and checking with locals can really help cue in some of these issues. I work for Extension. Extension is a great resource, and RCS in some areas can be really helpful, as well as local RC&Ds, as well as even industry or stakeholders that are working in there can really help you with getting some specific information in your region. So what might be a recommendation for management in Wisconsin might not be a recommendation in North Dakota, California, or Texas too. So again, I encourage you to make those local contacts to talk about some of this information. I do also want to highlight a really good, if you really want a good document that talks about how to manage pasture and some of the simple principles, from as simple as fencing to how to rotationally graze to what species you should select for. In Wisconsin and the Midwest, we have this really great PDF called Pastures for Profit, and the URL is right here. You can purchase it, or you can actually download it for free as a PDF and view it, and it's like a 50-page document. So if you haven't seen that, that's a great resource. But I want to highlight how other states have lots of resources available to you as well. So being a Wisconsinite, I'm going to promote Wisconsin information, and just to highlight that we have a lot of resources available in through our extension system. So if you go to our learning store where we post all our extension material and you type in grazing, you can get over 25 publications that highlight anything from impacts to grassland birds, to how to graze streamside pastures effectively, to a wide range of other issues too. So I really encourage you to check with some of your local resources for some of that information, because it'll be tuned to the major issues that you will have in your region and your state. Okay, so let's get down to weeds. So weeds in pastures can, and I want to highlight can, really be competitive and reduce the amount of desirable forages. That's very regionally specific, and we'll talk about that in a second. They also can reduce the palatability or the utilization, or the ability for these animals to eat that forage present. And the most important one, I should probably put this on top, is they can affect animal health and or performance. And so we're going to talk about each of these areas, because these are what you need to think about when you have weeds in your pasture. So first off, let's talk about weeds and how they can impact the forage present. Here's a picture of some research that we've done. You can see on your left, there's an area where we've managed the weeds, and it's essentially completely grass. Excellent forage, highly desirable for our beef cattle operations, cow-calf pairs. Where on your right, as you can see, we have not managed the weeds, and we have, you probably can't recognize it here, but lots of Canada thistle in that picture. So a lot of a really difficult to control weed is present in that area. So many of you would say, I want on the left, I don't want to see what's on the right. And just to show you some data behind that, what we find is when we get rid of those weeds, which is that blue and purple bar, we're actually getting rid of a lot of the total forage that's present in here. And although in some cases we do see an increase in grasses, in this case, the green bars, where we eliminated these these weeds, we did not see an increase. We saw similar amounts of grass, whether we had the weeds or not. And in this case, using herbicides and broadcasting them, we eliminated the clover, which was really desirable. The key point I'm trying to make here is not the impacts from using the herbicide, but the fact that weeds in many cases rarely reduce the total amount of forage. So if you look at this bar on the left, we're always going to get less overall biomass when we control the weeds. But in some instances, particularly where precipitation or dry conditions exist, we can get a reduction in the amount of desirable species when we have weeds present. And as you're going to see, is I'm going to make the case that many of our weed species that we don't think of as forage, maybe we should think of as forage. And so I'm waiting for the next slide to come up. So why am I considering weeds a forage? Well, we have instances where we can get animals to eat these weeds. And as you saw in the previous slide, weeds can be a substantial amount of forage. So here's a really good example of two different instances where I have dairy cows eating Canada thistle, and these are biennial thistles that you see them grazing or browsing on too. So that can happen. Well, you may say, oh, well, they may eat them, but they're really bad in forage quality. Well, there actually has been a lot of research done, and not all, but many of the weeds actually have really high forage quality. Here's a quote from Neil Martin, who was the former head of our Dairy Forage Research Center here in Wisconsin, saying Canada thistle, which is really in the Midwest and East Coast, really enemy number one in our pastures, believe it or not, has equivalent forage quality to that of alfalfa. And dandelions, which a lot of people don't like and try and manage, also have very high forage quality comparable to alfalfa as well too. So if we can get them to eat it, they actually will perform fairly well in many cases, believe it or not. And when we look at the forage quality of weeds, it's really a spectrum, and we really have to look at the individual species. But in general, many of the weeds have high forage quality, and kind of the rules of thumb, particularly with annual weeds, that we want to consider if we can get animals to eat them when they're vegetative and before they produce really thick woody stems and flowers, the forage quality is very high, often comparable to or very close to some of those desirable forages that are present. But what we do see as that those plants start to flower and produce viable seeds, and that stem starts to get weedy, the quality declines really, really quickly, much faster than our desirable forage. So really that time frame to manage them is really, really short. Annual grasses will always have much less protein than some of our others, so protein intake may become an issue with annual grasses, but again, if we can feed on them when they're vegetative, the forage quality is not bad. It may not be excellent, but it's not bad. And then what's really interesting is that many of our perennial broadleaf weeds actually have really good forage quality, and it's just an issue of getting them to utilize or eat those species. Dandelions, plantains, white cockle, a lot of those have fairly decent to excellent forage quality. So we really need to look and see what those species that are present and what they are. But many of those have low palatability, particularly like spiny weeds. This is a picture of plumeless thistle, one of our really invasive biennial thistles we have in the upper Midwest. In the West, you might see a lot of musk thistle or bull thistle or other common species as well. And research has been done that shows that when these get really spiny, they can reduce, you can get very little feeding on these spiny plants just because they're spiny. The livestock do not want to feed on them. But not only do they not feed on those plants, they do not feed on the plant and the desirable forage nearby. And up to 72% of the nearby forage is sometimes left untouched. And hopefully you can see that from this picture. We have these spiny plants. We didn't release the animals to graze until the day before this picture was taken. And as you can see, they left these very significant ungrazed areas. And that's unutilized, really desirable clover and orchard grass. Because of the spiny nature of that. But obviously this impact is very dependent on the stage when you're grazing. If we graze this much earlier or later in the season where we didn't have the spines weren't as stiff, we would lessen that impact. But that is a potential impact that we do have to be aware of. The good news though is that we can alter that utilization. Here's a picture of Canada thistle where we've gotten significant animals to eat a significant component of that. We can alter that by training animals, and there's actually protocols where people actually train animals to prefer spiny weeds. And so there's efforts underway to do that and train your animals. And we can also do that by changing our grazing methods. And we've done a lot of work on Canada thistle, so I'll just briefly summarize that. If we can put really high stocking densities or a mob grazing situation, we can get them to eat 80+% in some instances of those Canada thistle stems, even when they're really spiny. If we have a typical rotational grazing setup that's, I would say, moderate to high intensity rotational grazing stocking, they'll eat anywhere from 40 to 60% of those plants. But here's the big difference. If we're in a continual grazing system where they have choice, they eat very little of those because they have lots of choices that are present out there. And I kind of use the analogy, it's kind of like when we're in a buffet line or at a reception and there's a lot of people there and there's the cheese plate, everyone's going for the cheese plate because they want to eat that really high quality cheese. But if there's a lot of people, you're going to put something on your plate because the fear is if you come back the next time, there won't be any food available. So there's like selectivity that's present as a part of this, changing and increasing our stocking density. But there's challenges, so you may think, oh, great, well, we'll just change our stocking density and they'll eat those plants that they're not eating and the problems all go away. Well, there actually are problems associated with this. There's logistical issues on how you can change your stocking density. You might not just have the setup to do that. You might not have the animals or the acreage. So those are other issues we can talk about in the Q&A. But one of the biggest issues is when you're reducing this selectivity, you may cause some of your animals to select toxic or poisonous plants. And a real good example that we have in the Midwest is world milkweed. It's actually a native milkweed, highly toxic. If they can eat, a 0.5% of their body weight, they can potentially be fatal to a livestock. But in a continuous or rotationally grazed situation, none of it's eaten. They completely 100% avoid this. But as we increase that stocking density, we increase that risk of them actually grazing it and having some toxicity issues too. So we do need to be aware of toxic plants are really a critical area that we need to worry about, particularly if we're increasing our stocking density. So I do want to point that issue out. And so that brings up the other issue that is probably the number one priority is we need to make sure that we know what toxic and poisonous plants are in our area, and we make sure that our animals are not ingesting those toxic plants. Poisonous plants are very location specific. So again, we encourage you to reach out to your local resources and get that information. They can be poisonous or toxic. In Wisconsin, where we have a lot of milk production, we're concerned about some of these that are changing the flavor of milk. Interestingly enough, now we're actually interested in promoting those because some of our artisan cheese making really likes those unique flavors too. So it's just showing you how we're changing some of our approaches. And then even some of these may not directly injure the animals, but they may cause some physical impediments which could injure the animals, such as a lot of dairy cows grazing on yellow foxtail that has produced seed. There's been data to show that it can increase the prevalence of pink eye. So there's a lot of direct and indirect impacts of having weeds present in your pasture that you need to be aware of. But this is really a big priority issue that we need to watch out for. So what's poisonous plants are in your area? You really need to check local resources. Again, we've created this great resource in Wisconsin that highlights this issue. And we'll highlight this. You can download it at that extension resource. And if you can't get the link, I'd be happy to send you a link and a free PDF, or you can purchase like a little hand field guide. We're relatively fortunate in the West or in the Midwest that while we do have toxic plants, it's rare that we get a toxic plant situation, although we can get it a lot more common in the West and in the South where we have more issues. And it's particular situations where we need to be more concerned about toxicity. And I can talk about that in the Q&A if you do have those questions. So if weeds are present in your pastures, you have problems, what I recommend doing again is identifying first so you can figure out what you have and then help prioritize some of your efforts. Monitor those populations if you're not sure if they're bad or not at the time. Are they getting worse? Are they not getting worse? And we had a few examples of people brought in over time that kind of highlight the situations. And then really, if you feel like these are poisonous plants or these are a concern or they're getting worse over time, you need to think about how can I change my management to deal with this. And it may be as simple as manipulating your current pasture management practices. So alter how you're grazing, maybe adding a little bit of fertilization, some pasture renovation. Or in some instances, it may be a situation where you look at applying additional management methods like herbicides, mowing, burning, we can talk about later, things of that nature too. So I think following this approach can really help you be effective, particularly for some of the part-time growers and farmers who just have limited time and resources to do this. And I do want to acknowledge that a lot of times we don't have all the resources to conduct everything. So we need to really help prioritize what's the worst conditions. So how do you identify your pasture weeds? There's lots of tools available. We developed the Dirty Dozen in Wisconsin, and there's a lot of local resources and guides that can help you identify. We've created a weed identification database. This is this weedid.wis.edu. That's actually enabled now that you can select California or Colorado and you can actually search for weed species. What's really neat about these databases, and there's other states that have these, is you can say, I don't know what this weed species is, but I know it has yellow flowers and opposite leaves, and up will come up pictures of plants with yellow flowers and opposite leaves, and you can just look through the pictures and help identify your species through there. So there's lots of tools to help you with those, and I've just highlighted a couple for the region. There are now even apps where you can take pictures, and they will tell you what those weed species are by the pictures. I caution you to be careful on those apps. My experience is they're right about a third to half of the time. So you need to really be critical to make sure that they're right. And again, I'd like to, influence that, you contact and get involved with some of those local experts in extension in Wisconsin or your area, or someone who works in that industry can really help with identification as well. And a lot of times identification is critical, but also understanding the life cycle of the plant can help with figuring out how to manage it. So is it an annual weed? That means it's going to germinate and die in 1 year from seed. Is it a biennial weed? This would be like wild carrots would be a good example of that. Burdock would be another good example, where it germinates, stays as a bunch of leaves we call rosettes, flowers in the second year and dies. Or is it a perennial that's a simple or creeping perennial? And just for the sake of time, I'm not going to go over this, but knowing this information really helps us understand why this is a problem. Sometimes, like annual weeds, a lot of times indicate an overgrazed situation or a drought situation. Biennial weeds can be as simple as you just had a disturbance in one case, like maybe you left your animals out, it rained and they really mucked up the area. You're doing good grazing management, but just a bad situation, and these took advantage of that opening and are present, and et cetera. So lots of information we can glean for that, and maybe on trying to save time for Q&A, we can talk about some of the details. But I think really the key is for you guys who have weeds is to prioritize your weeds, number one. Figure out which ones are problems and make sure you get rid of the worst one first, and then think about these other ones and if it's important and how to approach this. So in my prioritization process, if it's a toxic plant, that's priority number one. But you got to learn, how much of it do they need to eat in order for it to be toxic, and how palatable or how willing are these animals to eat this? For example, we have poison hemlock in Wisconsin, highly toxic if they eat a tenth to half a pound of it, which for a cow, it's usually like a pound, they could die. But it's really, really unpalatable. So they're not going to eat it unless there's no forage available or they're in an ultra high stocking density. So that kind of can put some things in perspective. Palatability is also a really big concern that we need to worry about, because even if it's high forage quality, if they're not eating it, there's going to be no benefit from it. Forage quality is another issue, but as I've talked about before, forage quality a lot of times has to do with the timing of when they're eating it. So it's stage dependent on that weed. And then, we also have to think about the competitive effect of these weeds. In Wisconsin, we're really blessed. We have really competitive pastures. And even if we have weeds present, more times than not, the weeds aren't reducing the biomass of the desirable forage. They're just adding to that biomass. I would say definitely in the South and in the West, that is not the case. We can get significant losses in biomass of desirable forages when we have weeds present. So again, that's very regionally specific. So managing them will get a boost in your biomass of your desirable forage. And then I think you also got to think about, maybe it's not a problem in pastures, but maybe this is a really aggressive weed in other farms or people nearby, and you want to be a good neighbor and you want to get rid of them so your pasture isn't a source for invading other areas too. So lots of issues surrounding there as well. So it's these good questions going on, and so I'm trying to get through this so we can answer lots of those questions. I do want to emphasize that in pasture-based systems, really those continuously grazed systems tend to have a much larger impact on weed species than our rotationally grazed systems. I'm not trying to be negative of continuously grazed systems. There's a lot of reasons why those are in place, but weeds have a bigger impact in those systems. And so we might want to consider spending more resources towards managing it If we can adopt more intensive rotationally grazed systems, a lot of times just tweaking that system can help us deal with a lot of those weed species. And just those little tweaks can help reduce that impact. And we might need to do some added techniques in other cases too. So again, very regionally specific. So there might be specific conditions that may not apply to that, but some general thoughts to consider. So if we decide to manage, what can we do? What are some of our tools in our toolbox? Again, manipulating some management of your grazing or fertilization is probably the first cornerstone that I'm going to look at. I have these weeds popping up. Can I alter my grazing frequency, my stocking rate? And a lot of times our pastures are limited by fertilization. Maybe these weeds being present are just an indication that we have some imbalances in our fertility in our soil. So doing a soil test and spending a little bit of money to add some fertility to the soil may solve all those problems as well. We can also do some additional inputs such as some timely mowing and even some herbicides. And I think there's fits in there depending on the weed species and your management system that we can utilize some of those. But these are our general tools that we're relying on in our toolbox. I, again, like to focus on manipulating the pasture management can really be the key. You know, weeds are sometimes just a symptom of something going wrong. It may be simply as poor as, hey, it didn't rain very much and the weeds took over. And there's not a lot, unless we have access to irrigation, there's not a lot we can do about that. But a lot of times weeds take over because the desirable forage can't deal with the poor fertility of the soil. In some cases, we might be overgrazing or doing improper grazing at the wrong time, and the weed species are taking over from that. And in some cases, we may just have a very non-competitive forage species present. In this picture in the lower left-hand corner, you see Canada thistle taking over. It's because we have Kentucky bluegrass, which is not a very competitive forage species. If we renovated that area and brought in more competitive forage grasses like orchard grass, tall fescue, meadow fescue, that Canada thistle would be much less of a problem. So just little simple tweaks can really help in many cases. The other thing that I like to think about in this slide is coming up of this is changing our grazing practices. And we did some studies where we looked at continuous grazing, rotational grazing, using a herbicide, and mob grazing. And you can see some really big differences here. So I just want to spend a little bit of time focusing on this. In a continuously grazed system, as you see over here on the left, we had basically the animals. In this case, it was some heifers decided that they didn't want to graze this wild carrot or Queen Anne's lace at all. So it was a total runaway situation, as you see there. But in this back area here that was rotationally grazed, you can see that wild carrot is there, but it's a lot less dense and much less of a problem. This plot over here is also rotationally grazed. We could spray a herbicide and essentially eliminate it. So herbicides also worked well. But as you can see, if we really increased our stocking rate and mob grazed, it looked as good as that herbicide at eliminating that problem. So different options exist, and depending which options you want to utilize, we can get really high levels of control. So how to maximize grazing for weed control, because there's a lot of interest in doing that. Intensifying your rotational grazing practice would be my first practice. Again, identifying which weed species you're concerned about and trying to target that grazing to reduce those impact. If they're annual or biannual weeds, we really want to target that grazing when they're vegetative, before they have those woody stems and before they're flowering, so they don't produce viable seeds. And if we can do that for 2 to 3 years, we should see a really sharp reduction if we can get them to eat those animals. If we have perennials, you know, we're going to have less luck, and it's going to have to graze for 3 to 4 years to probably see an effect, and be a little bit more aggressive at increasing that stocking rate. And we want to make sure and prevent those from flowering if at all possible. And we want to keep repeating it over time, and those are going to be the most successful. And they're really going to actually promote, if we can have proper rest periods, promote the competitiveness of those grass species. And really the kicker is trying to get them to eat that, because that's the control mechanism. If the palatability of those weeds is high, we don't have to do a lot with our stocking density, but if that palatability is low with our spiny weeds, we're going to need to increase that stocking density significantly. And so that can be a challenge. You may be acreage limited and other things. We also want to consider avoiding overgrazing. A lot of these weed species germinate and needs light to germinate. And so if we're grazing where we're seeing a lot of bare soil present, it's opening an opportunity for more seedlings to germinate. Here's pictures of Canada thistle and burdock seedlings germinating. But if we can not overgraze, leave enough residual so there's no bare ground, I know in some cases that's a challenge, we're going to limit or if not eliminate those from even germinating so they don't become large and we don't have to manage them in future years. So that can be a really big benefit when we do that. We've actually done a lot of research in the Midwest, and what we found is if we can leave 6 inches of residual going into the fall, so right now, we can reduce emergence of a lot of our biennial and perennial weed seedlings, which germinate in the spring, by up to 75%. So we can get a really sharp reduction just by leaving a little bit more cover in the fall. Well, obviously, there's some negative associated with that. If we're leaving more cover, that's more biomass. We're not feeding our animals, so there's clearly a trade-off. But we feel like that 6-inch residual is really a good target that you should be grazing, leaving to minimize that emergence the following spring. And in some areas, particularly in the West, you can get some emergence even in the fall as well. Mowing is another option that can work really well if we can target that time frame. Really, the goal is to wait until those plants are just beginning to flower or they're in the flower bud stage and try to target mowing in that time frame. What that does with annuals and biennials, it will not kill the plants, but it'll really set them back because they're producing a lot of energy to produce those flowers, and there'll be a minimal component in the later harvest. You may have to do that twice a year in the lower Midwestern states and the West. In the upper Midwest, a lot of times we can just get away with one well-timed mowing in the middle of June. Can really have some benefits, but it doesn't work as well on our perennial and simple perennial and creeping perennial weeds. What I like about mowing is it works really well with a lot of other techniques, and a lot of people are already mowing their pastures. So just think about mowing it right when you see those flowers start to appear or right before they're starting to appear. My message is usually when you see the first plant start to flower, that's when you should be mowing to prevent seed production, but it is very species specific. Pasture renovation can also help. If you think you have some really non-competitive pasture grasses, think of really focusing on the forage grasses to try and renovate your pastures. Those tend to be the most competitive. Some studies came out from Pennsylvania that looked at that, and they found forage grasses were really providing the most competition on many of our weed species, much more than our legumes, and just trying to get the best adapted variety is really, really effective. Herbicides are another option. There's a lot of benefits of the herbicide. It's really easy to utilize. They're relatively cheap, and you can get really consistent control on hard to control weeds. So we do a lot of research on herbicide use. And this picture was an example of using, in this picture, we used Milestone, a similar product, but is a little bit different, would be Grazing Next. It can give you high levels of control, but there are negative consequences to herbicides we need to think about. And that negative consequences involve if you want legumes in your pasture, if you're broadcasting them, you're going to eliminate those legumes for a year or more. And some of those herbicides have severe restrictions on manure, if you collect manure, where it can be spread in the following year, because some of that herbicide can persist in that manure for up to a year plus. And so we need to be aware of some of those restrictions because they can be pretty significant in some cases. And what I tell people is that while herbicides are a great tool, if we have lots of legumes, we can do a lot of damage by spraying a herbicide. As you can see, this is the uncontrol on the right. We see a lot of burdock and other weeds, but a lot of clovers in here as well, more clovers than grass. And so when we sprayed a herbicide on the left, we killed all that burdock and everything else, but look at all the bare ground that was present. So it's we're losing a lot of forage. And so in some instances, there's going to be a lot of renovation that's going to need to occur in combination with this herbicide use. So we need to think about that before broadcasting. So maybe spot spraying would have been a better option if we were going to use a herbicide in this case. So again, to kind of summarize kind of the approach I'm looking at, if weeds are present in your pasture, you really want to identify those weeds and try and use that identification to prioritize management, particularly if there's toxic or poisonous plants. Monitor closely if you're unsure if these are problematic weeds and seeing if these are spreading, or if your animals are eating them readily, you may not worry about them as much. And then if you are concerned about them, manage them and thinking about how am I going to manage these weeds, and you have lots of tools and you just need to figure out which of these tools or levers you want to utilize or which combination in order to help with management. And I like to say you should start with looking at your grazing management approaches and seeing if you can manage those. If not, there's some added inputs like as fertilization, herbicides, and mowing that can be included as well. But it's really a species-specific decision. So what was neat about this, and Larissa really, I have to give her credit, did a lot of the effort in pulling this together. We asked for some examples of what are weed species and problems that people are having, and to provide examples. And we had 3 examples from 3 different parts of the US. So let's look at some of these examples that were provided, and I can kind of walk through what this is. This first case is from an individual in Vermont who is an intensively managed rotational grazing system with a medium stocking density. And I want to just look at this picture and say, first, he's doing a great job. He's got really competitive forage that's present in here. And as you can see from this picture, he's showing you pictures of 1 or 2 weeds, but it's not a lot of weeds, it's just a few weeds. So his first weed that he had a concern was chicory. And chicory is a really interesting plant because it's a highly desirable forage when it's a rosette, but as it produces a flower, it actually becomes very unpalatable, and this is why this is a problem. So my guess is this might have been in part of his initial pasture mix. So if you could really focus grazing when it's a rosette, this plant probably isn't much of a problem. It can be managed with herbicides, well-timed mowing, or just intensive grazing. Another weed species that he had in this picture looks to be in the genus Ambrosia, which is a ragweed species or a bursage. I think this plant is actually annual ragweed that has just escaped. There was an open patch probably in this area where this plant has been allowed to germinate, grow, and is just producing seed. So really, unless this plant is really, really common, I don't think there needs to be any intensive management. Just maybe be looking for this in some of these open areas and trying to do a well-timed mowing, or just maybe tolerating that this plant is present here if you can't, there's not a lot of it. The third species he brought up, I'm not sure on what it could be because all I saw were these yellow flowers. It could be in the genus Lactuca, which could be a prickly lettuce, but it also could be this plant called nipplewort, which is, I think, more common on the eastern side of Wisconsin. So maybe look at some of those. It was tough to identify, and I couldn't see any leaves, just these yellow flowers. I'm going to go through these pretty fast just because I want to save time for questions. This other West Virginia example was really good from someone who has goats, New Zealand Kikos. They found this weed species that I'll show you pictures of this weed species that at first they didn't have very much of it, but it seemed to every year get worse and worse and worse. And then they had a drought, as you can see in this picture, and it's really taking over where it's a third of the biomass to a quarter of the biomass. So what should we do? Well, this species, and I'm going to show you some picture close-ups, is actually creeping Charlie or ground ivy, which is a very common lawn weed. So I think this weed is a symptom of having a very tight grazing or continuous graze system where you're not giving enough rest for those grasses to recover and really compete. So I'd recommend you trying to, if you have the land, increase more rest into your grazing practice. Under drought conditions, it's really tough. This is where this weed really takes over. If interested, a range of broadleaf herbicides would be really effective in managing this. But again, if you have clovers in that system, you need to be aware of that too. And so my guess is you might just be grazing a little bit too low to the ground and really trying to, if you're able to reintroduce more rotation into your system and a fall application of one of the broadleaf herbicides, several of them should give you 100% control of this, 90 to 100% for 1 to 2 years. We also did get an email from North Carolina with a couple species, and just for the sake of time, I'll emphasize that this species on the right is one of the smartweed. We typically have 3 or 4 different species. I can't differentiate, but I think this is one of these perennial smartweeds. We're starting to see a lot more of those, and they can be a challenge to manage. It seemed like they were doing a pretty good job rotational grazing it, and I couldn't identify this other one. So maybe some additional information or follow-up questions can help me with trying to identify it. It looks like someone's thinking it might be another Artemisia. It could potentially also be a wormwood species. I just need more pictures to be able to get a firm idea of what that species is. But potentially maybe increasing your resting period a little bit more might help. I know that this smartweed was really common in Wisconsin this year too, so it might just been a really good year for this species. So with that, I want to just thank you for your time and open it up for some Q&A. Hopefully I have at least a good amount of time left. I know I went through a lot, and so feel free to contact me with more questions. And I don't know, Larissa, if there's more specific questions you want to highlight, and we can go from there.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Mark. It was really excellent presentation. There were some questions that rolled in during the presentation. Some I think were kind of answered, and then some I'm going to read out loud, and you can tell us what you think. So a couple people were just wondering more about if you could speak a little bit more about how to either train your animals to perhaps eat some of the less desirable species. Is there a way besides, I guess, or maybe it is just based on your stocking density? Someone was suggesting maybe having a medium stocking density and leaving them there until the weeds are eaten. And any thoughts on kind of steps with that?
Yeah, there are a couple ways. And I think the first thing to do a quick Google search. I think there's a couple people that actually have highlighted methods to train your animals to eat weed species. I think there's someone by the name of Voth, V-O-T-H, that has a nice website with some information. So I don't know what those techniques are, but I think it involves basically training 1 or 2 animals and then using those as trainer animals to train your rest of your herd to preferentially go after some of these weed species. So that's the level of detail. The other option is just to increase your stocking density to a level where their selectivity goes down. It's the herd mentality. I think both of those have shown value, and there's pluses and minuses of doing each one of those. And the key issue I just want to emphasize is make sure that what you're training them to eat is not a toxic plant, because that's when we can run into problems.
So yeah, actually a couple questions about toxicity. First one, some plants are toxic before cutting and haying, and could you name some of those?
Yeah, and so this is where it gets really complicated, and plants are really complex organisms. If you're a plant geek like I am, it's super interesting. But for those of you trying to just use them as to make up part of your operation, it can be a challenge. So there's a whole bunch of different compounds that make plants toxic, and some of those compounds, when you hay something and let it dry out, they become less toxic or not toxic at all. And other compounds persist and are toxic even when you dry those materials. And so it's really on a species by species basis to understand that. So what we've done with our poisonous plant guide is we have detailed information that tells you is if the toxicity remains in dried forage or if not. If it doesn't, then the beauty of it is if you have toxic plants, you can just hay it, let it dry, and then you can feed it and not worry about it. Part of the reason of us creating that fact sheet is I could never remember off the top of my head which ones become non-toxic when you dry and when you aren't. So I would just encourage you to download that PDF or purchase that, and that has information. There's lots of other really, really good resources available to you. There's actually a toxic and poisonous plant center in Logan, Utah that researches this and has fact sheets. So lots of good information out there for you to look through.
Excellent. Could you speak a little bit more specifically about Queen Anne's lace and kind of the quantity that might be toxic and at the seed stage? at
Yeah,
the seed stage?
so this is one of those that we don't have a lot of really good information on this. There's just some anecdotal information from reports from veterinarians and others. There have been to my knowledge, no specific feeding studies to determine the levels. And so
Hmm.
I don't want to say this is a recommendation, but if people are concerned about the amounts of forage that could pose a risk, we think it's similar to other related species. And so we kind of say that we think that there can be some toxicity that is the result of eating large amounts of Queen Anne's lace. And we're talking of like in the 15 to 20% of their biomass or their feed is consisting of Queen Anne's lace. And so it's definitely not a small amount, like 1 or 2% of their feed, or 1 or 2% of their body weight. It's a larger amount. It's exactly what that amount is, we don't know. We have a lot of Queen Anne's lace or wild carrot in Wisconsin, and a lot of it is eaten. So it's not a small amount; it's a large amount. I think what that amount is, I can't say specifically, but I think it's in that 15 to 20% range.
Okay, that's good. We had a question if you could talk a little bit more about maybe preferential or ideal timing for herbicide application. If I were wanting to use it, is there a best time to use it, or what part of the year would it be just wasting my money?
Right. So this is a great question, and it's totally dependent on the target weed species. So many of our perennial weeds, not all, but many of them we're targeting in the fall. So like right around a frost or right before a frost is a really good time for Canada thistle and other perennial weeds if they're still green and actively growing. Many of our annual weeds we're targeting right after they emerge in the spring. Some of our perennials we are managing them then, particularly in the lower Midwest and in the South, because that's when they come up and that's when they're going to compete with our desirable forage. So it's really on a region by region and case by case basis. And so I'd really encourage you to talk to some of your local cooperators and stakeholders to give you that information. It just really depends on the species and a lot of other factors.
Thank you. Someone's asking about sagebrush, and can it be chopped or remediated?
So sagebrush is a challenge. I don't have a ton of experience with sagebrush, but there is a lot of data on chopping it, dragging it, and doing other things. And I'm assuming the sagebrush is to be they want to reduce the sagebrush because there actually is interest in other areas to increase sagebrush for various reasons, for conservation, for wildlife habitat. But yes, there is some effectiveness in it in reducing but not eliminating it from my limited knowledge. But I would encourage you to reach out to like your local NRCS or extension agent. There's tons of information available on sagebrush management in the West.
Great. So a question coming in from southern Wisconsin. They're wondering if it's too late to overseed with grass seed via disc seeder, or is there still time this fall?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's so they can try to do it. It's really you're really rolling the dice, and I would say it's like at this timing, unless you're using one species, which I'll recommend, you're really going to roll your dice on the level of success. And it's even worse than going and betting like red or black on roulette. I think it's like in the 10 to 15% success rate. And the one exception is cereal rye, which is an annual plant. Is we can still seed it in late October to early November, and we will get regrowth in the spring. And you can get some biomass, but it's an annual, not a perennial. Or a short-lived perennial. It'll only last through the next growing season. If you do seed some perennial grasses, you could frost seed. They would most likely be a frost seeded situation where they won't germinate until next spring. And sometimes those can work, but I would recommend in that case waiting until that frost freeze cycle, which is usually in early April, and going in with a no-till drill and drilling into those fields. I think that would be a much higher success rate than doing a seeding practice now.
Mm-hmm. So we have time for just a couple more that have come in, questions that is. Question, you mentioned that mowing works really well with other types of management. Can you elaborate a bit? For example, when would you put your animals on the field, after or before you mow?
Yeah, and so I'm going to give a Wisconsin example, and so I don't know how well it will be to this. Does this user say where they're from?
I don't have it.
Yeah, that's fine. I can just give
She's
some
Colorado.
general. Yeah. So in Colorado, it's a little bit more of a challenge too. In Wisconsin, we're blessed that we have really competitive forage. And usually our annuals and biennials don't start to flower until middle of June, late June. And so what we can do is get 1 or 2 rotationally grazed intervals, maybe 3. And then right then is when, if we miss any of the seed heads that are made by tall fescue and some of our annual grass, forage grasses, we can go in and clip those seed heads and do a well-timed mowing. And usually there's not enough, there's really competitive forages present, not enough time in the year where those will likely resprout, and they may or may not produce viable seeds. Out west, you just don't have as competitive of forages, and you're limited by precip. So you're probably gonna have to mow more often, and you'll probably get less than ideal control unless you have a really wet year or have the ability to irrigate. So we're just blessed in the Midwest. You're a little bit more challenged out there, depending where you are in Colorado.
All right. Is there a database someone's asking for forage value for the different weeds, including protein, palatability, etc.?
There is not an extensive database, but there is a really nice fact sheet that I believe, I want to say that not Vermont, I want to say it was Virginia Tech has created that highlights these.
Mhm.
The challenge is it all depends on what stage of develop some of those species are. So we have some general tables that we could share on weed species. I think this Virginia Tech fact sheet that I'm thinking of, if you probably Googled like weeds and forage quality, it would pop up. So there's data out there, but there's not as comprehensive database. I've often thought about if I struck it rich, that would be a thing that I could create. But we unfortunately don't have a very comprehensive list of that. But there is some information out there that they can.
Okay. So I think we'll take 1 or 2 more here. Someone writes in, they have a toxic mint problem. Plants remain after the rotation,
Yeah.
and I have concern that they're causing problems for the herd.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, I
guess
think it's this. I think they're from the southern part of the U.S. and I'm forgetting, it's like perilla mint or something else. And so they've had some really big issues with that toxic mint. And from what I've heard from colleagues of mine that are in those states, I'm thinking like Tennessee and to the south, is they're really relying on broadcast applications of herbicides to control those.
Mhm.
I don't remember the details. So I'd encourage they look up their extension specialists in those states to find out the local recommendations. But there's some big problems out there, and toxicity is a big issue with them.
Yeah.
That is really competitive in their pastures.
Excellent. Well, let me just move on here because we're just about out of time. Before we do end, I do have a couple of housekeeping items. As a reminder, after this webinar, there's going to be a really, really brief survey that pops up on your screen. So we would really appreciate it if you take a minute or two just to tell us about your experience and if you have thoughts for future webinars and how we can improve things. And as I mentioned earlier, a recording of the webinar in the slides will be available. I'm going to be archiving them on the website and also emailing them to you in the morning. We do have a couple more webinars coming up this winter, or this fall. Next week, we'll be discussing the newly updated animal welfare certification guide for farmers and also sharing tips about our Fund to Farmer grants. And again, I'll include links to the webinars and the grants in my follow-up email. Dr. Renz, do you have any other parting thoughts before I close the webinar?
No, I don't. I just want to thank you for the opportunity, and it was great to talk to others. And if you guys have questions, feel free to reach out to me or one of your equivalents of me in the nearby region, and I'm sure that they'd be happy to help you with your issues.
Excellent. Yes, I'll be CCing Mark on the email tomorrow. So folks that do have one opportunity for follow-up. I know there's a couple people that wanted to send you more photos that will be made available. It's been a real pleasure to have you with us, Mark. Thanks for being here and sharing your experience and your insight, and for taking the time to answer all the questions we got through. I'd also like to thank everyone out in the audience for their interest and their attention, and I hope that we see you on another webinar again soon. So have a terrific afternoon, and goodbye for now.